The American Ethical Union, inspiring ethical communities for a world that is democratic, compassionate, just, and sustainable. The American Ethical Union All Societies Program, March 29th, 2026. How to be foolproof in today's news environment with Eric Schurenberg. We're coming to you today from the Ethical Culture Society of Essex County in Maplewood, New Jersey. I'm Elaine Durbach, the president of the society. Our guest today, Eric Shurenberg, was a very special selection because in this era of extraordinary media chaos, information distortion, and so on, he is somebody who is qualified in every aspect of this issue. Eric is a two-time National Magazine award-winning journalist. He is the founder of the Alliance for Trust in Media, a nonprofit organization helping newsrooms rebuild trust with audiences and helping audiences find trustworthy news in a chaotic information environment. Prior to establishing the Alliance, Eric was the CEO of the iconic business publications Inc. and Fast Company. He was the editor-in-chief of Money, assisting managing editor at Fortune, and founding editor at CBS Money Watch. He continues to advise journalists and entrepreneurs through his role as distinguished instructor in journalism at the University of Chicago and as a mentor at the Founders Box Accelerator and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce.
All right. So, ironic as it may sound, I think one of the best places to start a discussion about how to navigate the digital AI-inflected 21st century information environment is by starting in the 15th century. In 1450, one of the most revolutionary innovations in media technology was introduced, the movable type printing press. It's hard to imagine, as we look back on it today, a greater blessing for the spread of knowledge and access to information and growth of civilization than the printing press. And yet, about 30 years after the first books rolled off Johannes Gutenberg's printing press, another book appeared called Malleus Maleficarum, which is usually translated from the Latin as Hammer of the Witches. And this book not only made the case that witchcraft was real, but also that witches were heretics and that they should be tortured to extract confessions from them. And once they confessed, they should be burned at the stake. The Catholic Church, which was the gatekeeper of information in that era, did not approve of this book, and yet it became extremely popular. And in some parts of Europe, it was the second most read book after the Bible. And it ushered in, for 200 years, a hysteria about witchcraft that led to the torture and death of tens of thousands of innocent people. And it wasn't until the rise of the Enlightenment, the ascendance of the powers of reason, that the hysteria ended. So why am I bringing this up? Because there are many parallels now to what we're going through. Every innovation in information technology has a dark side and a light side. And every innovation you can think of, from the printing press to high-speed presses in the 18th century and 19th century, to the telegraph, radio, television, the internet, AI, they all do the same thing. They increase access to information. They make it possible for content creators to reach directly to their audiences, bypassing the gatekeepers, whoever they might be, the Catholic Church in the 15th century, mainstream media in the 21st century. And while they increase access to knowledge, they also leave in the hands of the audiences the judgment, the requirement to judge whether what they're reading or watching is true or not. So as we navigate the 21st century information ecosystem, we're kind of rehashing a pretty familiar old dynamic between access and judgment about news. After 400 years of technological innovation, we have access to information on a level that 400 years ago, 40 years ago, would have seemed godlike. And yet, the technology that we have that we need to use to judge whether what we're seeing is true or false is pretty much the same as they had in the 15th century, which is our brains, our primate brains. So it seems like pretty much an unfair fight between modern technology and our human brains, but it's not. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So we have two goals. The first is to understand what's going on in today's media ecosystem. If you can understand the incentives that drive how news is created and how it's distributed, you can defend yourself against it better. And secondly, we'll cover some quick techniques for recognizing information that you can trust. The Supreme Court Justice, Oliver Wendell Holmes, described the information ecosystem of his era, which was the beginning of the 20th century, as the marketplace of ideas, a phrase you've probably heard. And while that may be a pretty optimistic way to describe what's going on today, it's kind of useful to think of today's massive information ecosystem as a marketplace, because like every marketplace, it has a supply side and a demand side. The supply side is the vast network of content creators. So not just traditional media outlets like the New York Times and the BBC, but also everyone else. Joe Rogan's podcast, Russian troll farms, your crazy uncle posting on Facebook, TikTok dance videos, and the things that people say to each other. It's all part of this vast, complex, internally contradictory information and distribution ecosystem. And on the demand side is all of us consumers of news. So let's start with the supply side. And I'll start by trying to frame the information ecosystem today by describing what it's not. So imagine an ideal supply side that's devoted to truth. And the metaphor I come up with when I think of that imaginary supply side is a library. And what distinguishes this kind of idealized library is the number of gatekeepers. So there are the book authors who try to get things right in the books. There are the book publishers who don't want to publish anything that doesn't seem true. There is the orderly arrangement of the library that makes it possible for you to find what you want without being distracted by other things. And if all those other gatekeepers fail, there is this imaginary librarian here who's totally dedicated to making sure that you get the knowledge that you seek. Of course, that's not the world we operate in. So sticking with the library metaphor, this is kind of a representation of the world we live in. So you walk into this metaphorical library of the internet, and instead of seeing rows of orderly books, you're just assaulted by all these random pages. Out of context, you don't know which you can believe and which you can't. And there is no gatekeeper. The only gatekeeper is a machine whose goal is not to tell you the truth, but just to keep you flicking at those pages and pulling them off like you were addicted to them. So that's the world that we operate in. When people talk about the media, especially people in the government these days, they're generally referring to traditional legacy media, but that's really only a tiny part and diminishing part of the information ecosystem today. It is now a social media world. And just to put that kind of in numbers, let's compare the New York Times which is sort of the avatar of a very successful legacy media operation, and YouTube, one of the most powerful social media platforms. So the Times publishes 200 edited, fact-checked stories every day. It has an audience of 110 million, which is why it's one of the most influential and successful legacy publications in the world today. But even so, it is dwarfed by YouTube, which uploads 2.6 million videos every day and has an audience of 2.7 billion people. Now, there are lots of reasons that people might prefer YouTube to the New York Times. One thing, it's free. The Times has a paywall. YouTube is free. A lot of people prefer to get their information from videos, and that's what YouTube specializes, while the New York Times is still largely print oriented. And also, YouTube is encyclopedic, and I've used it for everything from, watching old movies or video podcasts to like figuring out how to change the taillight bulb on my Subaru. But the thing that makes YouTube much more successful commercially than the New York Times is not necessarily how it appeals to audiences, but how it appeals to advertisers. Both YouTube and the New York Times rely for their business model mainly on advertising, but YouTube is just a much better advertising deal from the advertiser's point of view. Now, let me kind of make sense of this complicated graphic about how the advertising world now operates by giving you an example. So let's say I'm on YouTube, I'm clicking on a video about how to change the light bulbs on my Subaru, and up pops a video ad for Apple Watch. Now, if your idea of how the advertising market and media works was formed by watching Mad Men, you might think that, oh, well, an ad salesman from YouTube took an ad buyer from Apple out to lunch and got a contract to carry ads from Apple Watch. But that's almost certainly not what happened in this case. What almost certainly happened instead was that as I clicked on that video, a message went out to a computer called an ad exchange. And the message was a middle-aged man from New Jersey who owns a Subaru and has all the characteristics that suggests about that person is about to see an ad. What am I bid for that person's attention? And an auction occurs. And in our example, Apple wins the auction. The Apple Watch ad is served, and it pops up on my screen before the video about the light bulb comes on. All this happens automatically, driven by artificial intelligence. It happens so quickly, no one even notices. So what does this mean for the information ecosystem as you perceive it as a news consumer? Well, first of all, it means that advertisers don't know where their ads appear. Apple doesn't care that its ad was shown on YouTube. Might as well have been shown on Breitbart or ESPN or the New York Times or an ISIS recruiting site. All Apple cares about is that a likely customer is shown their ad. Second order of logic here is that the advertising dollars flow to outlets, publishers, whatever you want to call them, that know their audience best. And the outlets that know their audience best are obviously social media platforms because they have a complete record of what you've said, what you've watched, where your interests lie, what you're like, what you even look like. From the publisher side, that means that success is all about gathering attention in the moment. Because the advertisers don't care about what your reputation is for truthfulness or not if you're a publisher. All it cares about is whether someone clicks on the story next to or the video next to which their ads run. There is no payment to the publisher until someone clicks on the story. So there's a real urgency in getting people to click. And finally, the other conclusion is that attention is all about mastering the algorithms that drive social media. So to be seen and promoted on a social media platform, the best way to get attention is to foster outrage or fear or some other emotion. Kind of the ultimate conclusion of this for the information environment is the gatekeepers are gradually being driven out of the business. Just to put some numbers behind that, almost 2 out of every $3 spent last year on digital advertising went to just 5 technology companies. Meta, which is Facebook and Instagram, Alphabet, which is Google and YouTube, Amazon, ByteDance, which is TikTok, and Microsoft, which runs LinkedIn as well as running most of the information infrastructure, the technology infrastructure behind the advertising world. Hardest hit in this new environment are local newsrooms, which have declined by 3,000 local newspapers in the past 20 years. We lose a local newsroom at the rate of about 2 per week, according to the Medill Local News Initiative. And then there's, even in the newsrooms that still exist, the workforce is being hollowed out. More than half of reporters and columnists that were employed 20 years ago are no longer employed now. So the workforce has been cut by more than half. In any industry, that kind of decline in workforce is catastrophic. And it has brought some remarkable, very difficult changes throughout traditional media. One change is that there is more opinion and less journalism now in the information ecosystem. So if you feel like, God, I wish someone would just give me the news and not opinion, you're right. That's what's happening. Most of your news feed is not news. It's not new information that's been generated by reporters. It's commentary or opinion or analysis of news that somebody else reported or about what someone else said about what someone else reported. Or it's memes, which are simply images that are meant to be quick takes, usually mocking or humorous, about news that somebody else has reported. What news really is generated, which really contains original information, still comes from legacy newsrooms, mostly newspapers. But because they're suffering so much financially, even they are filling their news sites and pages increasingly with opinion. It is much cheaper to hire someone like Jesse Waters, shown here from Fox News, to opine on the news that someone else created than it is to send a reporter to Ukraine or the Persian Gulf or Trenton or Albany or Sacramento to cover the state capital. Another change is that what does get reported, what does appear in the ecosystem is more likely to generate heat rather than insight. Remember that the algorithms on social media are driven to prioritize high emotion. This has been true forever, that outrage and fear attract attention. That was even true in headlines throughout the history of media. But social media algorithms intensify that. And some of the evidence is shown here in this headline from the Washington Post from a few years ago, based on internal Facebook documents that were revealed by the whistleblower Frances Haugen, is that the algorithm weighted angry posts and angry reactions 5 times more heavily than posts that did not. Another outcome is that there is more propaganda coming from the outside. So up to this point, we've talked about the financial incentives behind clickbait and the rise of social media at the expense of traditional platforms. But financial reasons are not the only reason that someone might try to manipulate you or mislead you in today's information environment. Political power is another reason, obviously, that some people might choose to do that. And the most successful players in that field outside the US are the Russians, who actually invented the term disinformation. So what I'm about to show you is a video produced by the NBC reporter Brandy Zadrozhny about one particular propaganda campaign that was fostered by the Russians. And I want you to think about, or I want you to observe about how this program unfolded and how much of a commitment it required or didn't require from the Russians.
Late last year, this strange, and let's just say from the outset, false story started going around about Ukraine's Vladimir Zelensky.
Ukrainian President Zelensky somehow managed to buy two multi-million-dollar yachts.
Now, to be clear, nothing about the U.S. aid for yachts story was true. What was true? Vladimir Zelensky is the president of Ukraine. That checks out. And there is an ongoing debate about U.S. financial support for Ukraine. But there are a lot of these phony stories. NBC News has followed more than 40 over the last year. Clint Watts is an NBC News contributor. You've likely seen him in our coverage when there's big breaking stories. He's also the head of Microsoft's Threat Intelligence Center. Stories like these, Clint says, come straight through a pipeline, straight from Moscow, via something called Storm 1516.
Storm 1516 is what you would think of for the old troll farm, the Internet Research Agency, 10 years later, in that they need to adapt to a new medium, which is video, and they need to come up with a way to make disinformation.
Think of Storm 1516 almost like a disinformation production company. They follow a reliable path, one that starts with a cheaply made video.
Hey guys, my name is Olesya, and I'm a former employee of the so-called Troll Fabric.
I'm a senior associate scientist at a Pfizer facility in Kiev.
My name is Shahzad Nasser. I'm here to share an interesting discovery of mine.
The videos usually don't stay online long. They don't have to. They are just the kernels of so-called evidence in the pipeline.
According to this agreement I have managed to acquire, the yacht was referred to as Zelensky's yacht.
In this video, this isn't an actual journalist. His bio is faked, his true identity unknown. But his story is repackaged and amplified through the next part of the disinformation pipeline.
They then take those videos and they launder it through Telegram.
Telegram is a social media site popular with people kind of on the fringe.
But also through a series of websites that are made to look like local news sites.
The stories on those sites are shared on social media, first by known Russian propagandists, but then, if the plan works, by a U.S. audience. In this case, Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene sharing the story with her 3.7 million followers. Her office didn't respond to our multiple requests for comment. The pipeline that began in Russia, now practically flooding American voters with disinformation. And here's the thing, these videos that kick it all off, they're not even that sophisticated. Darren Linville, director of Clemson's Media Forensics Hub, says they don't have to be.
More than half, I would say, almost completely fail. But it doesn't matter because they're so cheap to do that you only need a few of them to hit to make it entirely worthwhile. And they've had more than a few hits.
These videos are now targeting U.S. voters, trying to conflate fact and fiction and create havoc heading into the election.
The information ecosystem appear in your newsfeed. It doesn't always have to be from the outside. So you might have heard Clint Watts in that video refer to fake news sites. These are called pink slime in the information ecosystem industry. They are fake news sites with names that sound like legitimate news sites. This is one called the Illinois Valley Times, but there are others, the San Francisco Sun, the Philly Leader, and in New Jersey Business Daily. They're often created by artificial intelligence. There are no reporters or anything associated with these news sites, and they fill the pages with made-up stories, often with a political slant. In this case of the Illinois Valley Times, you'll notice that every story lionizes a particular politician named Sue Rezin. That's not a legitimate news site. But it's made possible by the fact that this kind of news site can still make money because of programmatic advertising. And if things weren't bad enough just with programmatic advertising, now we are dealing with artificial intelligence, which makes it so much easier to spread false information. The following is a video by the New York Times opinion page and by a friend of mine, Claire Wardle, describing how deepfakes are playing into the information environment and what, surprisingly, may be the most harmful legacy of them. So let's take a look at this.
Hello. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about a new technology that's affecting famous people. Remember when Obama called Trump a dipshit?
Complete dipshit.
Or the time Kim Kardashian rapped?
Because I'm always half naked.
Or when Arnold Schwarzenegger impersonated himself?
Get out of this, the bomb in there. Get out!
Deepfake, deepfake, deepfake.
Gotta be kidding.
This is a deepfake too. I'm not Adele, but I am an expert in online manipulation. So deepfakes is a term that's used to describe video or audio files that have been created using artificial intelligence.
My favorite is probably Lisa Vanderpump.
It started as a very basic face swapping technology, and now it's turned into film-level CGI. There's been this huge explosion of like, oh my goodness, we can't trust anything. Yes, deepfakes are eerily dystopian, and they're only going to get more realistic and cheaper to make. But the panic around them is overblown. In fact, the alarmist hype is possibly more dangerous than the technology itself. Let me break this down. First, what everyone is freaking out about is actually not new. It's a much older phenomenon that I like to call the weaponization of context, or shallow fakes, with Photoshop and video editing software.
There's so many needs.
How about the time Nancy Pelosi appeared to be drunk while giving a speech?
But you never know with this president of the United States.
Turns out that video was just slowed down at 75%.
It was very strange.
You can have a really simplistic piece of misleading content that can do huge damage. For example, in the lead up to the midterms, we saw lots of imagery around this caravan of people who were moving towards the US. This photo was shared with captions demonizing the so-called migrant caravan at the US-Mexico border in 2018. But a reverse image search showed it was actually Pakistani refugees in Greece. You don't need deep fakes, AI technology to manipulate emotions or to spread misinformation. This brings me to my second point. What we should be really worried about is the liar's dividend. The lies and actions people will get away with by exploiting widespread skepticism to their own advantage. So remember the Access Hollywood tape that emerged a few weeks before the 2016 election?
And when you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything.
Whatever you want.
Around that time, Trump apologized, but then more recently, he's actually said, oh, I'm not sure if I actually said that. When anything can be fake, it becomes much easier for the guilty to dismiss the truth as fake. What really keeps me awake at night is less the technology, it's how we as a society respond to the idea that we can't trust what we see or what we hear. So if we are fear-mongering, if we are hyperbolic, if we are waving our hands in the air, that itself can be part of the problem. You can see where this road leads. As public trust in institutions like the media, education, and elections dwindles, then democracy itself becomes unsustainable. The way that we respond to this serious issue is critical. Partly this is the platforms thinking very seriously about what they do with this type of content, how they label this kind of content. Partly it's the public recognizing their own responsibility. And if you don't know 100% hand on heart this is true, please don't share, because it's not worth the risk. Hello.
A couple of things from that. I would emphasize how Claire mentioned that we are all responsible for sharing or not sharing information, as well as the social media platforms. We can't do anything about the social media platforms, but we can not allow ourselves to be part of the misinformation environment. A couple other things about AI that we can sort of conclude, although this technology is evolving very quickly and don't really know what the implications will be 5 years out or so. But it's pretty obvious that AI allows bad actors the opportunity to flood the environment with all sorts of misinformation, things that they might have done before, as Claire pointed out, but now they can do it at such incredible scale. Another thing she did not mention is that artificial intelligence robs mainstream media of traffic, which was already challenged by social media. When I was working at Inc. and Fast Company, and this is true still of most mainstream publications, traffic mainly comes by referral from Google. So you look up a question on Google in the old days, and it would give you a bunch of links, including mostly to mainstream media. And that's where traffic came from. Now, when you search for something on Google, artificial intelligence answers the question for you. You never have to link off Google and go to another site. What has happened is that mainstream media platforms like Reuters, the Associated Press, The Atlantic, many other places, having had their content stolen from them by artificial intelligence and having their traffic rerouted by Google and other search engines, what they're getting instead are licensing fees from the big platforms. So you might, if you were Reuters, get $10 million as a licensing fee in compensation for having your content stolen and used to train AI models. That's some compensation, perhaps, but it also makes media even more beholden on giants. And there is an upside. So artificial intelligence makes journalists, particularly at understaffed places, which basically applies to every newsroom today, more efficient by allowing them to search data, to handle routine tasks more quickly, the same way that artificial intelligence is helping businesses across the board. Now let's move on to the demand side, which is all of us. We've talked about how the incentives on the supply side control the way the news is made and how it gets sent to us. But this question is about how we process it. We are the last line of defense in our own minds against disinformation. How you process it depends a lot on your frame of mind when you encounter the news. Now, you may be familiar with Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist who wrote Thinking Fast and Slow, about what Kahneman calls System 1 and System 2. System 1 is the frame of mind in which we are most of the time. It's fast, it's habitual, it's emotional. We're there most of the time because it saves energy. You don't want to have a great philosophical discussion about whether you should flip your turn signal before you turn in your car, or whether you should smile at a cute baby or say thank you when someone gives you something. This is all kind of System 1 thinking, fast, habitual, emotional. And when you consume news, when you're in System 1, you're likely to conclude that this story, this video seems true, is true if it feels true. That's fine, except that System 1 can be short-circuited by people who want to manipulate you. System 1 is prone to all kinds of shortcuts. That's why it saves energy. And Kahneman and other psychologists have identified many of them. You're familiar certainly with confirmation bias, which is the tendency of people to look for evidence that confirms what they already believe and ignore what they don't believe. And I won't go through all of these shortcuts in System 1, but there's one that is not that well known, but I'd like to point it out because it's just so it's so alarming, and that's called the illusory truth effect. The illusory truth effect holds that repetition of a claim makes that claim seem true simply by the fact of repetition. Research shows that even if you know the claim is untrue, it seems less untrue and more true just the more often you're exposed to it. So what's the antidote to consuming news in System 1? is to go into system two, which Kahneman describes as the thinking system, the deliberative, open-minded, intellectually humble system. You might think of it, system two, as the same thing as reason or scientific thinking. And when you consume news in system two, you're likely to conclude that this claim is true as long as there's evidence for it and as long as the evidence holds up. So if you spend most of your time in system one, you have to activate system two when you encounter a claim that you want to check out. How do you do that? There's a system that's easy to remember and very easy to put in place, developed by Mike Caulfield of the University of Washington. It's known by its acronym as SIFT. The S is for stop and understand the context of what you're encountering. I for investigate the source. F for finding other coverage, and T for tracing it back. So let's dig a little deeper. When you encounter a claim that you find dubious or triggering, stop and ask yourself, what is it I'm actually looking at? Is this news or is it something different, which most of your news feed is? Is it analysis of the news, which is trying to explain news, but adding a little bit of opinion in the process? Is it opinion where someone's trying to persuade you? Or is it a meme? Secondly, does the claim use inflammatory language? Is it meant to trigger your emotions and throw you back into system one? Another question you want to ask as you consider the context of the claim is, what's going on in the world that might lie behind this claim? And the related question is, who benefits from this story? In the video about Zelensky's yacht, obviously the Russians have an interest in making Americans mistrust Ukraine and thinking that the dollars that they contribute to Ukraine for its defense against the Russian invasion is being misspent. Another important context under stopping is the context of you. So when a claim triggers you, that makes you angry or scares you or disgusts you, that's often a sign that it's meant to manipulate you. Now, not every emotional headline is false or meant to manipulate you, but I guarantee you that every claim that is trying to manipulate you will start with the emotions. Also ask yourself, what were you looking for when you read this, when you clicked on this story or watched this video? Were you looking to confirm an idea that you already had, or were you looking to expand your knowledge? Ask yourself if you know enough to judge the veracity of a claim. Let's say you read a tweet that tells you that ivermectin cured COVID for this person. Well, a tweet is 280 characters. Does reading 280 characters make you an epidemiologist suddenly? And finally, does the news match your favorite worldview? Does it confirm biases you already have? If it does, you're less likely to engage system two and more likely to default to system one thinking. I for investigate the source. So you can check out the news source, whether it has a political leaning on sites like Media Bias Fact Check or Ground News or All Sides. Also check the original source. Was the person quoted in the story in a position to actually know what they were talking about? Does that person have an agenda? And also, one indicator of trustworthiness is what psychologists refer to as friction costs. So when Frances Haugen reveals internal documents from Facebook, it's very likely that they're true, or at least I would give them more evidence because of the friction costs that she faced, the possible blowback, the lawsuits, the trouble she would be in with Facebook for having brought those documents out. It's much easier to simply opine on Twitter about something, but it's a lot more trustworthy when someone is actually paying a cost. Find other coverage. If something happened, it's been covered elsewhere, and you can get a second opinion. And when you get that second opinion, see what other oriented news sites are saying. All Sides, Ground News are two sites that aggregate coverage of stories from all sides of the political spectrum. And you can see the angles or the story or the coverage that you're missing in your own information bubble. And finally, If you're still in doubt, you can go back to the original source. If you're not sure what the meaning was of a Supreme Court opinion, for example, you can go back. It's published. You can read it for yourself. If you're unsure of the provenance of an image, for example, as in the example that that Claire showed about the immigrants who are actually Pakistani immigrants going to Greece, you can click on Google search, and it will tell you where that image originally appeared. Let me quickly go through an experience I had in evaluating a story that you all remember from last year, the tragic plane crash in the Potomac, where a helicopter and an American Airlines plane collided. Now, I first encountered the story on the Associated Press. Stop. The Associated Press is factual news, and also it was covered elsewhere. So the same story was repeated elsewhere. So it's probably highly credible. Then the next day, the New York Times ran this story about how Trump blamed DEI for the crash. Now, this is not news. I mean, it is true that Trump said that, so that's a factual reporting. But the spin that the Times put on it is analysis. The Times is trying to put this into context. And you can tell from the headlines, it's a little argumentative story, which was about a lawsuit against the FAA alleging that DEI had disadvantaged some worthy candidates for air traffic control. Now, the New York Post and Fox News and other news organizations of that political leaning spend a lot of time trying to explain what people would call sane washing, things that the president has said. And I interpreted that as being the main intent behind this story. On the other hand, the story quoted an industry newspaper called AV Web about the FAA. So I decided to see what their original source was. And there, AV Web confirmed that there was indeed a lawsuit about the FAA that was brought by a candidate for air traffic controller who had spent 3 years and hundreds of thousands of dollars on tuition to become an air traffic controller, who was derailed, according to his claim, at the last minute by a quiz that was clearly meant to favor applicants of color. Now, did this make me think that Trump was right, that DEI had something to do with the crash? Of course not. That is a ridiculous claim. Did it make me think that Trump was actually presidential by making that claim? No, no way. But it did make me change my mind about whether he was making this idea up out of whole cloth. There was a legitimate grievance about the FAA's hiring practices. It had nothing to do with this crash, but it did bring an outlandish claim from pure hallucination into the realm of real grievance. All right, let's review. If you take away nothing from this conversation except these 3 points, these are the things that will be the most useful tools in helping you become foolproof. So when you encounter a claim that triggers you, stop. Engage system 2. There is plenty of pollution out in the current information environment, but you don't have to be part of it. You don't have to contribute to the pollution. So ask yourself, what is the context? What's the intent of this story? Does it fit my favorite political narrative and make me let my guard down? And also think about the context of you, of how you're processing this. Secondly, get a second opinion. Give more weight to those other sources of coverage that challenge your point of view about things, that use measured language rather than inflammatory language, that have friction costs, that are transparent. And finally, this, which may be the golden rule of media literacy, is practice what the psychologists call actively open-minded thinking. Actively seek out other points of view. Admit you don't know when you don't know. and be willing to change your mind. Remember that the thing that eventually ended the hysteria around witchcraft was the growth of the Enlightenment, the growth of reason. That is your superpower in making yourself unable to be manipulated by bad actors in today's information environment. There will still be plenty of people who, for profit or political power, or just because they want to increase their friend list, will try to manipulate you. But if you follow these 3 points, and especially if you practice actively open-minded thinking, those people will have no power over you because you will be foolproof. Thank you. Now let me go on to what I'm calling the appendix to this speech. This is one of them. Questions, if that works for everyone.
Great. Thank you so much, Eric. That was extraordinary. A lot to digest and some very challenging calls to us, trying to stay open-minded. I think it's a challenge of our times. But you've given us tools, and that's a great beginning. Thank you so much. We are going to go on to questions from some of the societies around the country, and then we will try and open it up to more if we have time. Our first question is going to come from Jim Norman at the Bergen Ethical Society. Do we have Jim ready to go? And then we will be going on to Suzanne Jones, Terry Smith, Vandra Thorburn. Do we have Jim?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes,
we can. Thank you.
All right. What an interesting talk. It occurs to me that there's an old saying that a lie wakes up and is halfway around the world before the truth gets its pants on in the morning. I think we do all have an affirmative response as demand-side consumers of information to take the steps that you're talking about. But I also think that we have an obligation to do what we can to make sure that the supply side is staying honest. And taking the steps that you're talking about it sort of involves pulling our pants on in the morning and isn't really assertive enough to make sure that the information that we're getting is true and honest. Can you suggest anything that we can do to keep the supply side on the honest side of the equation?
Sure, Jim. Thanks for the question. The single most important thing you can do is to support legitimate news organizations. So subscribe to organizations that practice skills like, or virtues like, transparency and sharing sources and using measured language and telling and being fair in their and comprehensive in their coverage. The demand side can actually exert an awful lot of influence on the supply side. After all, it is us that the supply side is catering to. So while you are the keeper of your own gate, you can affect the supply side by supporting the legitimate gatekeepers out in the environment.
Our next question is coming from Suzanne Jones from the Long Island Ethical Society, who is in Honolulu in Hawaii. Welcome, Suzanne.
Sorry, my screen seems to identify me as BT, but I'm Suzanne. Good morning.
Welcome.
I very much enjoy receiving news with humor, and I am concerned about the censorship and the loss of our late night humorists as a media and a news source, and Stephen Colbert in particular. And as a former editor-in-chief at CBS, I'm wondering if you have some insight or perspective to offer do you think that the decision by CBS is truly a financial one, or are they being influenced politically? And this also leads me to question CBS in general as to whether or not they are censoring the news. 60-minute stories have come up as being withheld. And then again, I think of CBS News as legitimate gatekeepers that I can trust, but maybe not so much anymore.
Well, thank you for the question. I was the editor of CBS Money Watch, so one small part of CBS Interactive, and not the CBS Newsroom, which is now run by oh, please help me. Thank you, very wise. Who I used to include under that list of journalists who challenge me, because her political orientation is significantly to the right of mine. But I thought she was an honest reporter. CBS, like the Washington Post and other places, has new ownership, and owners have throughout history had an influence on the political orientation of the newsroom. So this is nothing new. What is new, I think, is the willingness of the current administration to exercise its power over the airwaves and other things like business combinations and mergers and so forth to influence the news in its favor. It's not unheard of. President Lincoln shut down 300 newsrooms during the Civil War that were opposed to him. Nixon made efforts to freeze out journalists, and every president has had problems with the coverage. This, I think, is something that it's regrettable, and I do think that the FCC should not be weighing in on the nature of coverage. I think the Pentagon should not be trying to censor coverage and steer all coverage towards supportive news. But I think this is something that will be solved by the information marketplace. If CBS becomes so slanted in its coverage that it cannot support a broad audience anymore, it will suffer and it will have to change. And you, if you perceive that about CBS, can have the freedom to vote with your feet and get your news from another source.
Thank you, Suzanne. I think that's a question a lot of us have had in our minds. And I think we have seen the marketplace responding. Many of us have changed our Sunday night routines, which is incredibly sad. Our next question is coming from Terry Smith. Hi, Terry. Thank you so much for joining us from the Washington Ethical Society.
Thank you. I really enjoyed your talk, and I particularly like the move toward practical applications. And I have a practical problem that I run into often that I would like your advice or suggestions with. And that is on Instagram or Facebook, I see a post from someone who I know personally, perhaps a high school classmate, that just seems to me outrageous. It's actually appealing to System 1. And I'd like to move things towards System 2. Any suggestions about how to do that?
I would say first of all, you have the privilege of ignoring it. And for your sake of your sanity, that may and also for the civility of the exchange around that may be your best strategy. Don't feed the beast. But if you, depending on your relationship with the person who's posted, you might try a System 2 kind of response and just respectfully say that you disagree and here's why, and not to create a flame war online, but simply to express an opinion that is reasonable. Those are that I guess I would say, I'm sure you see whatever your opinion is as reasonable and the other person's as unreasonable, but that is, I should say, sympathetic and respectful of their point of view, assuming good intentions while expressing your disagreement. You can do that with a DM so that it doesn't become a public embarrassment to them, perhaps, so they might see it that way. And depending also on your relationship with the person, it might be worth a conversation. It's much easier for things to go off the rails when you're not face to face with someone. And that's probably one of the reasons that social media becomes such an instigation to, uncivil conversation and extravagant, outrageous exchanges. Does that help, Jerry?
Thank you. Thanks very much, Terry. And we're going for our fourth question to Vandra Thorburn from the Brooklyn Society. Vandra, are you with us?
Hello there. Yes, I'm here. Hi there. I'm actually sitting next to Carl, and Carl has written out a question, and we got to give him.
Thank you, Vandra, and thank you for that excellent and incisive presentation. You've drawn a distinction, or you've discussed non-biased sources of information, and I want to delve into that a little bit with you, just ask a question. Obviously, there's a huge distinction which you're getting at between fact-based and non-fact-based reporting. But even fact-based reporting from news sources where we can assume, for the most part, the truth of the facts at issue, would you agree that all reporting involves some level of bias and that commentary and analysis is not absent from such reporting, and that while we should seek fact-based sources, that we need to approach those sources even with a critical eye, with our own analysis, and with a recognition that there may be salient facts that were omitted?
Yes, I would agree with you, Carl. And reporters are human, and they bring to their work the same kind of biases and beliefs that we all bring. But I would caveat that by saying a couple things. One is that you can examine the business model of the news source and figure out where those biases, or at least get an approximate idea where those biases are. So among the unbiased sources I mentioned were Reuters and AP and BBC. So those have an audience that is different from, say, the New York Times, let alone Fox, where, and you could also say the same about some of the broadcast networks as well. For the AP and Reuters, their audience is other newsrooms that carry their news. So they are highly incentive to keep as many people on the bus as possible. So they're going to be less argumentative than others, where, say, like the New York Times, which serves an audience of highly educated people who, by population level, tend to lean left, or Fox News, which declares itself to be the voice of conservative America. Jonah Goldberg, who's a columnist for The Dispatch, formerly a columnist for Fox News, and someone I turn to a lot for challenging my points of view, makes a distinction between unbiased reporting, which may be, at the 100% level, not possible, and honest reporting. So unbiased or objective versus honest. And you can be honest and still have a bias, especially if you're transparent about them, and that you base your opinion and your analysis on facts rather than rumors or inflammatory language. So I would say constantly be conscious that everything has a bias. Constantly do your best to expose yourself to other points of view so that you can see that there are different ways to look at this information. And confine yourself to organizations that have a reputation for factuality. That reputation, by the way, is recorded in places like All Sides and Ground News, which rate their, and also NewsGuard, another one which I did not mention, which rate organizations based on their reputation for factuality or their processes for winnowing out the bias that reporters may bring to the story, and their dedication to things like multiple sources and documentation and transparency.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Schurenberg. Great talk. So here's my question. In the example of the Potomac Air accident, Trump attempted to suggest that a trans service member was at fault. You said the New York Post story changed your mind. Disinformation benefits from a kernel of truth. So is it possible that the lawsuit featured in the New York Post story is actually the kernel of truth for a different disinformation story about transphobia, and that maybe you were right to trust your first reaction? Over.
Good question.
Okay, thanks, Emil. I'm not aware of the attempt to blame that crash on a transgender person. As I remember, there was a female pilot of the helicopter, but everyone else involved was cisgender male. So I may be underinformed about that. So I think it's you're right that there is always or frequently a kernel of truth behind a disinformation campaign. In this case, it was the recognition of that kernel that made me change my mind about how much of a hallucination this was on the part of the president, and how much of a sort of an opportunistic claim to make a political point that he has made before. It didn't mean that it wasn't opportunistic. It certainly did not mean that there was any reason to suspect that any of the people involved in that accident were anything more than victims of a terrible accident, and any reason to believe that any of them was unqualified to be doing what they were doing. But it did give me a sense of sympathy for people who might be looking for that kind of framing to this question.
Great. Thank you, Eric. Yeah, I think so often this man will grasp at one tiny seed that pollutes the entire picture, because that one seed has a validity while all the rest doesn't. Thank you. We have some questions coming up. We're going to go to Fika, then David, then Daniela. Fika, would you like to start?
But my question is, as a professional yourself, with seeing everything that we see in the world of journalism today, with all the really what I would call it, that we're all under psychological surveillance. We're being guided towards certain points in life that maybe some of us don't really appreciate. That comes with maximizing some issues and minimizing some other issues. What is your prognosis of the world to come? Because again, in every community, we have unethical people, and then we have dignified people, and that includes the community of journalists and journalism. So what is your prognosis? What is your prediction for the world to come? Do you think we could make, do you think there is any change to come? Or is this where we would be falling like that frog that gets cooked slowly, and before we know, we have lost our humanity furthermore? Thank you.
Thank you, Fika.
Yes, thank you, Fika, for that question. I may be an inveterate optimist, but I do believe that the pollution of the information environment is going to get so bad, I mean, it's already pretty bad, that what it will do is send people back to trusted sources of information. So sources that practice journalistic journalism at the highest levels of integrity, because when you can't tell if images are generated by artificial intelligence or were real events, if you can't tell whether a story was written by artificial intelligence or whether it was totally made up, or whether it was actually an professional attempt at an accurate rendition of events, you will have to go to sources that you know you can trust, not because you're going to have particular inside information about the events, but because you have trust that the processes of that institution are dedicated to uncovering the truth or or what is humanly possible, which is the closest approximation to the truth that is available at any given moment. So I think that things may get worse before they get better, but I do think that the outcome will be to drive people away from thinking that the news will find them and that they can be judges and that some random person posting on Instagram or Twitter is as reliable a source as a Wall Street Journal 3-month long investigation. And that will, in the end, have a halcyon effect of driving people back to a shared reality, a focus on reason and facts. I hope that's true.
That would be a great note to end on. Thank you, Eric. But we do have a couple more questions. David, one sentence question, please.
Okay. By David, I guess that's me, right? Okay. Yeah, Eric, great presentation. I'm really worried about AI because AI requires huge amounts of energy to keep those data centers going, and an enormous amount of water too. So there's that environmental aspect, which is enormous, and people need to be aware of. But do you think people might turn to AI as their first choice for a response to a query, whether it's current events related or something else, if they think that other sources are just biased? You know, they're just fed up with all the the traditional sources of info, and they just want AI because they perceive that AI itself is unbiased.
People may perceive that, and AI is certainly confident when it gives you an answer. That's clear. But it's often wrong, and I think people need to be aware of that. And it's particularly untrustworthy when it comes to simple arithmetic, which is kind of crazy considering how capable these tools are. Already, people are using artificial intelligence as a search engine. And, David, you may do that as well. I do. Searching for things on Google and finding the answer provided by Google's Gemini AI bot it saves a step. It's much more convenient, and it is, in that sense, a better product. I'm not in a position to comment. I don't know enough to comment on the environmental burden that artificial intelligence is imposing on our electrical grid and our water table and things like that. But the technology is here to stay. It's kind of very impressive, and it's already being used and has been used longer than we think before it sort of made its emergence into the public consciousness with large language models. So we will find a way to cope with it, I think. And what I hope is that legitimate newsrooms, professional newsrooms, begin to use it as a force for good. And already at the Alliance for Trust in Media, I'm seeing newsrooms that are doing that. But like with any technology, there are actors who will use it not for good.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Thanks, Eric. Daniela Giosefi.
Yes. Thank you so much for this very vital talk. So many people in the chat asked, do you think there's more propaganda coming from the far right than the left? And also, there's right now a big boycott of Chat GPT because of its closeness to the current government in the US. So that's a kind of a double-sided question, but I'd love to hear your opinion about why the UK was so much better at dealing with Fox News lies than we are here in the US.
To answer that to respond to that last statement is that the UK does not have the kind of commitment to free speech that we do because of the First Amendment. And that is borne out in a number of fields, including libel law. And that is simply a characteristic of the US, for better or for worse, arguably for better, I'd say, as a patriotic American. On the question of whether, I'm sorry, Danielle.
More propaganda on the
Oh,
far
yes, does
right.
propaganda come more from the right than, I would say that falsehood comes more from the right than the left. I mean, both political parties are aiming to persuade voters, and both political parties, like all politicians everywhere and forever, have shaded the truth to make a point. One of the things I like about PolitiFact, the fact-checking organization out of the Poynter Institute in Florida, is that it holds both Democrats and Republicans to account for their for being honest and factual. But the Republican Party, I think, and this is my opinion, has been traduced by its dependence on believing the 2020 election was stolen. As you know, as many people on this conversation know, expressing your belief that the 2020 election was stolen from President Trump is a requirement for getting a job in the Trump administration. And so that is basically provisioning your working in the government on a falsehood. Just to be even-handed, the left has had its own problems with ideas where they're willing to ignore inconvenient facts, as all human organizations do. But I would say that at this moment in history, the right is more inclined to lean on false statements than the left.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Eric. I can hear a ripple around the country of kind of agreement, but that might be a bias in our audience. Bill, do you have a question for Eric?
Yeah, maybe this is a bit ironic. Can we use AI to begin addressing those System 2 questions? I'm just thinking there's an article, and can AI do some kind of rudimentary answer to those System 2 questions?
Remember that artificial intelligence doesn't have emotions. And so it depends on, but its fealty to facts depends a lot on how it is trained. So there are instances where, and you've probably read about them, where AI models have gone completely off the rails and said the most absurd and bigoted things. And even more responsibly trained models can be manipulated into things that are harmful and false. What I've observed in my own uses of ChatGPT and Claude is that the initial reaction tends to be fairly measured, and that the models have clearly been trained to be even-handed and factual. I've never used Grok, and I think that probably is a lower priority for that particular AI model. But I would say that in System 2, it's sort of in your own human computer, your own brain, that there are instincts you have about the trustworthiness of a source and about the plausibility based on your own human experience about particular claims that give you an advantage over AI. I would say that using those large language models may be a step on the process of forming your own judgment about whether a claim is true or not, but it shouldn't be the final step.
Right. Okay.
Thanks,
Thank
Eric.
you.
I appreciate that. I belong to a writers' advice group that works out of Montclair, out of the Montclair Library, actually. And we had a talk on AI and how writers can use it. And the group leader asked ChatGPT whether AI was reliable. And he got, within 10 seconds, he got an answer, maybe less, 5 seconds. And it said no. It said pretty much what you said. The sources are generally reliable. The intention behind much of it is neutral. It can hallucinate. Never take it as the last word. Always check what you can. So, do we believe the AI?
One of the things that is part of the adoption of AI at newsrooms is that they are trained on the archives of that particular newsroom. The process is called RAG, for retrieval augmented something or other. And that is meant to make sure that the information that the model is trained on is verified and fact-checked. The problem with artificial intelligence from the foundational models like ChatGPT and Claude is it's trained on the entire internet. And so it's ingesting a lot of AI generated slop and falsehood along with other things, and it may not have the human experience to distinguish between the two.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Eric. I'm going to take 2 more questions from our audience and 1 from the AEU office. AEU, would you like to?
Yes. Before you go, Eric, can you please tell us what the Alliance for Trust in Media does?
Thank you, Jor. I appreciate that, and I am going to have to step off after this public service announcement. So the Alliance for Trust in Media is a nonprofit research and training organization, and it does 2 things. It works with newsrooms to foster innovations that are likely to build trust with audiences. The Alliance does not care what the innovation is as long as it's plausible. We come in and do the research so that we actually have evidence about what works and what doesn't in building trust so that every newsroom can apply it or avoid it in the future. Newsrooms, obviously, for many reasons, need to rebuild trust with their audiences, and this is one way to help that process. On the demand side of the equation, the Alliance has teachers who do this kind of workshop around media literacy for adults. There are other organizations that focus on getting media literacy training into classrooms, and God bless them. But this is for those of us who are no longer in school, but still need help navigating the digital environment. And we are a nonprofit, and donations are welcome. It supports our work and allows us to go into newsrooms and fund the research that will help them build trust with their audiences.
Fantastic project. Thank you so much. Go well. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday. Thank you for giving us your morning. All the very best.
It has been a real pleasure. Thank you all for attending. And Elaine and Jor, thank you for running the show. I really appreciate it.